Welcome to all the arriving retreat crew. Nice to see people gathering, and it seems like most everybody's here. I haven't seen Rick, but I don't know if he made it yet or not, but almost everybody's here anyway. And we're kind of in the home stretch period before the winter retreat starts in a few days. Kind of tidying up loose ends, getting people trained in job duties for the winter retreat. Enjoying a period of a lot of rain. I think I was just looking at the rain gauge. Over the past 5 days or so, we've had about 9 inches, which is great. More to come in the forecast. So the forest is turning into its winter mode, water running in the streams and moss on the trees brightening up, coolness in the air, freshness. Starting to get our minds around theme for the teachings, the readings that we do traditionally on an almost daily basis throughout the 3-month winter retreat. And we've decided this year to do kind of a revisit of a theme that we did more than 10 years ago. I'm not quite sure how long ago it was. But on the topic, around the theme of the fourth Satipatthana, the Satipatthana Sutta, the foundations of mindfulness, as it's commonly called, or more like the establishings of mindfulness, the 4 frames of reference, as Ajahn Jeff has referred to it. But specifically focusing on some of the topics and themes in the fourth Satipatthana. So a lot of teachings, the 5 basic categories, the 5 hindrances, the 5 khandhas, the 6 sense bases, the 7 factors of enlightenment, and the 4 noble truths. Wide variety of subject material to cover, very comprehensive Dhamma reflections, mental qualities as it's sometimes translated. Ones to be aware of, ones to develop, ones to work on relinquishing, and topics to help develop insight and following a path to the end of suffering. So quite a bit to start getting our minds and hearts around as we go. And we'll start with some introductory teachings before jumping right into that 4th frame of reference. So I'm looking forward to it, starting to get my mind around how to do some of the initial introductory reflections, what to focus on. But keeping in mind, this particular subject area we'll probably delve into a fair number of suttas and commentarial, modern-day commentarial teachings from some of our senior members in our wider community. And just to emphasize that even with a number of these teachings being fairly sutta-based or maybe explored a lot in more scholarly traditions, that our tradition is one of practical application. I think of the word opanayiko from our reflections, morning reflections in the chanting, to be brought inwards. So we use the teachings and the ones that we'll be exploring this next 3 months, as a basis for practice, not as a basis for developing information or developing a lot of intellectual knowledge or establishing opinions around or views or taking stances or having any kind of debates. That all keeps things on a very surface level. And in some ways, Ajahn Chah and our tradition really de-emphasizes scholastic pursuits, emphasizing, really applying the teachings and bringing them in and changing, developing our hearts, which can only be done through direct experience, direct practice, living the life. And establishing our attitudes rather than being the best at being able to recite suttas or talk about them on that conceptual level. So Ajahn Chah, in many ways, actually, sometimes very strongly discouraged that. I think as Westerners we need to pay a bit more attention to it because we haven't grown up in the Buddhist culture and haven't been exposed to things in our training as much. So we need to use the teachings we need to study the teachings in a judicious way and bring them in, but not get lost in, not get lost in the whole intellectual, conceptual, abstract side of things. So hopefully that's what we'll do, and that we'll take the opportunity to talk about some of these and then use them as a basis for reflection. It's also a time when some of the monastic community members occasionally take up some kinds of special practices, sometimes some of the more Dhutanga kind of practices, or what we would call ascetic practices. And some do and some don't. Time to kind of explore our minds and what we would like to, say, improve some of our habits and let go of some of our other habits. So there can be some judicious experimentation, not getting too far off the track of moderation. But kind of time of easing up on all of our duties so that we can kind of examine our hearts more clearly, see where we would like to direct our practice, do some experimentation. Kind of reminded a little bit on the teachings from the Buddha that he termed the middle way or the middle path. It's probably useful to reflect on that a bit at this point. In the time of the Buddha, there were a lot of different beliefs, spiritual practitioners, a lot of different philosophical systems. It was kind of a rich time of spiritual experimentation. And so many different beliefs and practices that we hear about and are referenced actually in the suttas, because the Buddha would have encounters with these various wandering ascetics and practitioners of different beliefs and have encounters with them. And there were a whole range of beliefs from from one side being kind of the side of sensual indulgence, because there was some beliefs, some spiritual practitioners believed essentially that there was no cause and effect, no results of actions, that no rebirth, kind of sort of a kind of a nothing mattered kind of philosophical view, which would result in, well, why not just get the most enjoyment out of life that you can, and then it's over, no worries. It's sort of a hedonistic kind of culture, all the way to other extremes of beliefs in determinism, that everything runs according to a karmic pattern that is completely predestined, and the various practices that came up as a result of that are sometimes also non-action because it's all not under our control in any way whatsoever. Sometimes there were, and then there was also quite a large group of varying ascetic wanderers who would base a lot of their practices on a law of karma, kamma in Pali, that was prevalent of the day, but not necessarily what the Buddha taught, but a sense of that there are the actions, past actions do produce effects that we feel, results. There are the results of karma that we experience from the past lives, present and in the present life. But kind of almost a belief that we were destined to have to experience all the results of past karma, and some pretty wild and woolly ways of trying to address that experience of past karma would come up. Different kind of strange practices, at least strange in our minds, that people would undertake, oftentimes very austere. Some of the reports of practices of people just walking on their toes, or walking on their heels, or nearly starving themselves to death through fasting to the point of emaciation, which the Buddha himself practiced in his experimentation. Inflicting pain in several ways. Self-mortification, I guess, is the way that the Buddha referred to it. So there were these practices of both sensual indulgence and self-mortification that the Buddha pointed to as either of two extremes. One of the more colorful ones that is in the reported in the Majjhima Nikaya is a kind of an interesting story of the Buddha being visited by two naked ascetics who approached him to ask him some questions, and one of them, his name was Puna, and he was what they called a ox duty ascetic, meaning that he kind of took on the persona of being an ox. And as the commentaries describe it, he would crawl around on his legs and arms like an animal, like an ox, and he strapped a pair of horns to his head and attached a tail to his backside and ate grass, grazed in the fields with the other ox. And he came with a friend of his, Sania, who was a dog duty ascetic, who essentially took up all the behaviors and practices of how a dog would act and behave, and that these were, their beliefs that would lead them to liberation. And so they came up to the Buddha, and as the story goes, the ox-duty ascetic Puna came down and crawling to the Buddha and kind of sat down, lay down beside the Buddha, and then Sanya, the dog-duty ascetic, came up and did the same and kind of like circled around him and sat down and curled up like a dog at the Buddha's feet. I can only imagine what the Buddha was thinking at that time. What an image. But and then Sanya, the dog-duty ascetic, asked the Buddha, says, Venerable Sir, can you tell me what the results of the practice of my friend here, the Puna, the dog of the ox-duty ascetic, will be? What will be his rebirth, his destination, and the results of this practice? And the Buddha basically says, "Don't ask me." And so Sanya again says, "Well, please tell me, what the results were." And the Buddha says again, "Don't ask that question, Sanya." And the third time, of course, he asks, and the Buddha says, "Well, you've asked me 3 times, so I'll have to give you an answer." And he said, if Puna, the ox-duty ascetic, performs all of his duties as an ox in the way that he describes and succeeds at them, then he will be reborn in the company of oxen. He will be reborn as an ox. But if he does it also, and I'm not sure if this is in the sutta or just in the commentaries, but if he actually does it, I think it is in the sutta, if he does it with the belief that this will purify his karma and cause him to be reborn in a higher realm, then that's wrong view. And the karma of acting on a wrong view like that is actually rebirth in the hell realms, not just, or possibly in the animal realms, but more likely in the hell realms, based on not only acting like that, but acting on the wrong view. And after the Buddha said this, the Puna, the ox-duty ascetic, cried out and burst into tears. And the Buddha says, "See, I told you, I didn't really want to answer this question." But then Puna says, "Well, I'm not crying because I'm so upset at myself, but just, I'm not, worried about what you said, but just that I've wasted so much time pursuing this path, if that's what the result is going to be." And then he asks the Buddha, "Well, what's the consequence of Sanya, the dog-duty ascetic, performing his duties? What will his rebirth be?" And you go through the sequence again of the Buddha saying, "Don't ask." 3 times he asks, and the Buddha says, "Okay." And then he more or less says the same thing. If he performs all of his duties as a dog, then he will be reborn in the company of dogs at the best. And if it's done with the wrong view that this will actually purify my karma, then the result is even worse. So, chastened by the Buddha's replies, they both say, "Okay, I want to change my ways, change my practices." And Puna, the ox-duty ascetic, says that from now on he is considering himself a devoted disciple lay disciple of the Buddha till the day he dies. And Sanya, even more inspired, requests the going forth from the Buddha to become a bhikkhu in the dispensation, and the Buddha grants him that wish and ordains him. And as the stock phrase goes, in no long time, Sanya became an arahant. Don't know what happened to Puna. So just you can see the wide variety of practices and things that people did based on the belief, and many of these practices, not all of them, but many of them come from that fundamental belief that we have to experience the results of all of our past karma, and these various practices were devised as ways to kind of accelerate that process. So that was a common understanding at the time. But the Buddha really refuted that belief in the way that karma worked, and pointed towards a different understanding of karma, which is kind of interesting because, mostly today people, follow how the Buddha taught it, but there are still some traditions that do teach that one has to experience the results of all of one's past karma in order to purify the mind and purify the heart in a way that leads to liberation. That everything that we did in the past that had some effect must kind of exhaust itself out in some way or another before liberation is attained or realized. So I kind of am bringing this up just because it's not an unheard of view these days, and can have a significant effect on people's practice if that's one that's picked up and held to. But if you really explore the teachings, you'll find just numerous examples of that kind of don't support that view, that lead in a different direction of the understanding of karma. Many stories of arahants through the suttas still experiencing the effects of karma, like Angulimala, who became liberated after leading a life as a serial killer, still experienced the karma of his actions even after he attained arahantship. Moggallana, chief disciple of the Buddha, experiencing a very violent death based on past karma from past lives, even though he was an arahant and chief disciple of the Buddha. And even the Buddha himself, after his enlightenment, experiencing the effect of some past karma in the form of various aches and pains and illnesses. So those examples are quite clear and prominent in the suttas, and also just the idea that is presented that we've lived innumerable past lives, infinite past lives creating karma, and that really, for all of it's essentially impossible for all of the results to come to fruition. If there was an infinite number of past lives creating karma, then there would have to be an infinite number of future lives to experience the results of it. So it just doesn't make a whole lot of logical sense, the way that most of our teachers see it. So just to kind of put that out there, that the teachings that the Buddha gave on karma were a lot more hopeful, in that Ajahn Jeff has a really nice way of describing the workings of karma in a succinct way, that there's both a linear way of viewing karma and also a synchronic, the linear and synchronic aspects of karma. So that the linear being past actions will have an effect in the present and in the future, and any actions that we now engage in, intentional actions that we engage in the present, will have effects in the present and in the future. So that the linear aspect covers past to present to future, and the synchronic says basically also that we have ability to affect our experience from past karma by being present and attentive as to how we hold it right here in the present moment, and that affects our present experience of karma, both karma that's being made right here and right now, and from the past. So there's both this linear experience of the actions of karma, or the results of karma, and also the synchronic. And this gives us the ability to affect our experience. We don't always have the control over what comes to us from past karma, but we do have the control of how to hold it here in the present moment and how to transform our experience. Essentially, the teachings on liberation then are not one of needing to experience all the results of past karma, but of liberation is realized through purifying the underlying defilements in the heart. So that rather than having to experience the results of all past action, we look deeper into the causes of creating rebirth-producing karma, or karma that leads us into suffering. The anusaya, the underlying tendencies, the kilesa, the defilements of the heart. The practice that the Buddha teaches is how to purify the mind, purify the heart, so that the whole karmic process unravels. And even though there's still the results coming from past karma, that karma is the kind of karma that is made that will result in continuing existence in samsara is eliminated. And so it's a matter of purifying the heart of these defilements rather than experiencing the results of past karma. And this is what we have the ability to do, and the whole training is around that purification of the mind, purification of the heart. So that we can take up certain practices and training, like some people might do during the winter retreat, that could be considered a bit more on the ascetic side. But we pick them up not to, purify past actions or to kind of speed up the process of experiencing the results of karma, but as a way of counteracting the defilements, particularly the stronger ones that we might have, that lead us into repetitively causing ourselves suffering through old habits, old ways of being, old reactions, and ways of kind of being a bit more restrained, or certain practices to help counteract strong habits that aren't very fruitful. So oftentimes people, many of our strong habits center around things like food, attachment to food, one of our few sensual pleasures. So sometimes people pick up certain practices of watching their minds when certain foods that are particularly pleasing and gratifying come up, of reducing intake or eliminating intake and seeing how that goes. Restraint around the sensual aspects of food, and seeing what the effects are, or maybe sleep. If one finds oneself enjoying the annihilation of sleep a little bit too much, and taking advantage of what's going to be quite an open schedule for the retreat, and just kind of snoozing all afternoon, or taking long periods of rest, couple of hours, enjoying the deliciousness of not having to experience the world, then one might pick up some of the more some of the practices that are intended towards inducing wakefulness by counteracting that tendency to just nap out, staying up later, and getting up earlier. We'll have, not during the group practice sessions, but during the sessions in between when there's no schedule, have the opportunity to voluntarily or optionally choose to do some of the all-night vigils on the one praz. So experimenting with that, if one wishes. And maybe things around conversation and speech, we generally tend to encourage a moderation in speech, but just being aware of when the tendency is to distract oneself or find some pleasure in long conversations that maybe don't need to be so long or involved, using speech skillfully. In Thailand, or Ajahn Chai even especially, there's the admonition to eat little, sleep little, and talk little. You hear that kind of refrain a lot. And so these are sometimes some of the practices that people will take up if their particular inclination is to indulge in either one or several of those practices of eating, sleeping, talking. But to also keep in mind a balance that we don't want to become so uptight around all of these things that we make our lives miserable for ourselves and for others by a strict adherence to the point of making ourselves difficult to be around and possibly causing ourselves excessive discomfort or harm that maybe is a bit too vigorous. So learning how to weigh what it is that we want to take up as a practice and make sure that we're not going to either extremes of just being lazy and taking it easy and using the retreat to kind of drift, or being overzealous to the point of creating a lot of tension. Because the goal we're looking for in a retreat like this is to really enjoy the practice, enjoy the opportunity, and to enjoy the results of what this practice can be, particularly in the long term, of an easeful well-being, but it's based on simplicity and relinquishment, letting go of the things that prevent us from realizing that kind of ease of mind, ease of heart, a gentle well-being that delights in simplicity, delights in peace, calm, and openness. So we have to keep in mind what it is, the mind state that we're looking for, and weigh our practices against those benchmarks. One of the Buddha's teachings comes to mind. It's called the four bases of success. Success in, essentially, as we are taught in our tradition, applying that particular teaching to general success in any kind of practice, spiritual practice. And there's what they call the four bases are chanda, virya, chitta, vimamsa, which chanda meaning inspiration or desire, healthy desire, zeal, to pick up something or to work on some sort of underlying habit that we have that causes us pain, that causes us suffering, and to start to examine it and see if there's ways that we can let that unravel. So we develop this interest, and oftentimes it's based on really squarely looking at the suffering that it causes us, and having an open inquiry, wanting to have an open inquiry into, okay, this is something that is a strong tendency of mine, and it causes me difficulty, it causes me suffering. So what to do, how to work with that. And that kind of interest gives rise to virya, energy, to pursue an ending to that kind of habitual tendency. And with that energy and interest, we apply the mind to a certain approach that we think might help. That's the citta aspect, applying the mind. And we go and we take up the practice, or take up the reflection, or try and work with a particular hindrance or defilement based on our understanding and from the teachings, discussion with our spiritual friends, and then we really do our best to work with that and bring it into being. And then lastly, the vimamsa, the evaluation, a very important part of it. What is the effect of what it is that I'm doing? Is it working? And not just in a short term, because many of these things that we'll take up for reflection and investigation and in the meditation practice lead to at least some temporary discomfort, because we're going against the old habits, and the mind rebels. And a lot of these things that bring up unpleasant feeling, we have habits around to essentially get rid of the unpleasant feeling, whether it's through distraction or indulgence or avoidance. The goal is that we're working towards is to not have to experience that. So when we confront them or test them or put up a barrier against the usual ways of getting some temporary gratification, we're going to experience some rebound effects. It's just the way that it works. It's like being in the pressure cooker. The heat is turned up and the pressure is turned up, and the defilements don't go down easily. So that there's a bit of reverberation in the heart. So that's to be expected. But in the long run, how does it feel? Is there, at least through confronting and developing different kinds of mind states and different habits and opening ourselves up to the experience, practicing with patience, developing some skillful qualities to help hold all of this, does that at least give a sense of ease? Is there a result in after some time where there's an ease of mind and a relinquishment, a letting go of these old habits and tendencies? Oftentimes through just simplification, through not struggling so much, there can be a release. So if we can see that, and if we realize that there is a release from some of these habits, then that's our vimamsa, that's our evaluation. We are realizing, okay, there is something to this. It actually works, even if it's just a small hint of release or freedom, then that's reinforcement that what we're doing is the right thing. So the benchmarks of peace, space, patience, a little bit of relaxation, ease of mind, understanding. These are some benchmarks that show, okay, this is the right path. If the result is just continuing to be more dukkha, more tension, more uptightness, more if the results are agitating and not peaceful in the long run. If we find people avoiding us, if we're becoming harder to be around, we're becoming more of a burden, and being difficult to be with, argumentative, or any of these kinds of negative qualities, then perhaps we've picked up the wrong practice. So very important, this evaluation process. How's it affecting? How's it affecting my heart? How's it affecting my relations in the community? What's its impact? So that helps determine what we pick up and what we don't pick up. So realizing that we have the opportunity coming up to move in, bring the training inwards, use the teachings in a judicious way that really informs our practice. Experimenting if we would like to, but keeping in mind overall the goal of ease and well-being. Nobody wants to live for 3 months just pursuing a path that feels like it's just leading to suffering. And there'll be times when there'll be struggles, and we might need to loosen up a little bit, not too tight, not too loose. And if we need to engage in some conversation to get some perspective, or to let off a little steam, or just to enjoy a little bit of kindness and support from friends, even in a kind of a casual way, that's fine. If it starts to move into just kind of idle chatter and distraction, then maybe that's time to kind of close that particular conversation. But we want ourselves to enjoy this time. We want it to be useful, and we need to put effort into it and not just drift and be lazy. But we also want to develop practices and habits that lead to that well-being that the Buddha talks about. That's part of the practice, and it's not something that you have to struggle with and experience a lot of excruciating pain and difficulty and hardship, and then you gain liberation. But it's meant to be, as the Buddha talks about, beautiful in the beginning, beautiful in the middle, beautiful in the end. So that little by little we experience the benefits of the practice through a gradual loosening, opening, relaxing, relinquishing, and just opening the heart, opening the mind, opening the senses to what we have as a potential. Using the supports, and we've got a good group of people here to help us do the duties that we normally do, so we can relax around that. We've got a beautiful forest, nature, running water, that all, if we open our senses a bit and look around us and let it permeate our minds and our bodies, that just being in the forest alone is stilling and peaceful, simple, uncomplicated. So using the environment, using the supports, using the structure when we have it. We'll have just 3 separate weeks of group practice, and then the rest will be open. So using the structure, supporting each other when there is structure, letting people enjoy the support of practicing together, and then relaxing and opening and enjoying the space in between those times, allowing the heart to just simplify, settle, and open. We've got it all here, and my wish is that everybody takes good advantage of that, and that over the next few days we'll be finishing up the organizing and the training. And then also really much wanting to welcome the retreat crew to join in the practice when they're not involved with duties, and to wish everyone hopefully a very sublime and useful and peaceful retreat coming up. So I'll leave that for tonight's reflection.